And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer. We're not going to let that happen. The dollar, you ever hear the expression, dollar is king? The dollar is king. We're going to keep it that way.
Well, Trump certainly would want to keep the dollar king, and all Americans would want that as well, because if the US dollar is no longer the global reserve currency, we're in a lot of trouble. That could lead to significant inflation, higher interest rates, and a lot of economic turmoil for the American people. And it seems like Trump understands that. However, while the US dollar does remain dominant as the world's reserve currency, there might be some trouble in paradise as these so-called Brics nations are essentially working together to dethrone the US dollar. Now, Trump, again, plans to retaliate, and I'll show you how in just a minute. But let's actually start with what Brics is, okay, and what these nations expressed, their expressed commitment, okay, during their annual summit, which just took place earlier this month. Now, Brics comprises of 10 countries, and that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Indonesia, the UAE, and Iran. And they are focusing on two different things. I'm going to start with the alternatives to what's known as the SWIFT system. So during their annual summit, Brics leaders have basically issued this 31-page statement reaffirming their commitment to undermine the US dollar. Now, while they don't plan to create some new currency to do so, they are creating an alternative to something called SWIFT. Now, if you're unfamiliar with SWIFT, that means you're a normal person. Most people are not familiar with it. However, SWIFT is the international payment / banking system that is dominated by the United States and Europe. Now, the alternative is Brics Pay for Brics nations or nations doing trade with Brics, or M-Bridge, which is, which includes non-Brics countries. So they're trying to find a different way of doing international payments and banking without having to rely on SWIFT, which again is controlled and mostly dominated by the West, the United States and Europe. Also, a key goal is to enable payments in local currencies, which would reduce the need for conversion to US dollars when these trade deals are happening between countries that are interested in kind of moving away from the BRICS system. And this can really lower transaction costs for them, but obviously be detrimental for the West. Now, 50 countries have reportedly expressed interest in joining this Brics Pay initiative. And that does have some American politicians concerned, including President Donald Trump. Now, if you're wondering, what is the motivation behind this? Well, developing nations would have a massive, giant interest in setting up these alternative international banking systems because BRICS countries, particularly Russia, have faced sanctions that have impacted their ability to even use SWIFT for international payments. So they're looking for a workaround here. Okay, so for many emerging economies, gold serves as a form of geopolitical insurance. Treasury holdings and access to SWIFT can be frozen at any time. It's more challenging to do the same with physical gold stored in a domestic vault. And that is the second part of what BRICS nations are doing. They're trying to move away from investing in, the US dollar, and instead they're parking their savings in gold. That's what they're investing in. And if you take a look at this headline, you have a financial institution like UBS calling the US dollar unattractive as gold becomes a preferred reserve asset. So the international community, again, has basically decided to invest in gold in lieu of US currency. Let's take a look at this graph, and what it'll show you is, it's a representation of how the US dollar is at a 3-year low while the value of gold has really shot up. The green line represents the US dollar. The yellow line represents gold. Institutions now hold nearly as much gold as they did back in 1965, which was, during the Bretton Woods era. And according to the World Gold Council's survey of other nations, of course, a whopping 95% of central banks expect to increase their gold reserves over the next 12 months. So the US dollar index, according to Forbes, when measured against a basket of other major currencies, has actually declined 10% this year through mid-June. So we're talking about the entirety of Trump's second term. We've seen a decline in the value of the US dollar. But Trump, of course, is typically unable to look inward. He is unable to take ownership of mistakes that he may have made. Some of the decisions he may have made that led to the decline of the US dollar. And David Morrison of Trade Nation, he's a senior analyst with Trade Nation, says that Trump's tariffs, the fact that many investors view his administration as somewhat chaotic, along with concerns over US national debt, have seen the dollar fall out of favor. And what did Trump literally just do? Well, he pushed for the passage of this major omnibus bill that adds another $3.4 trillion to our debt, our current debt of $37 trillion. So that's all to say that the international community is kind of looking at the United States and they're like, I don't know, man. Do we really want to have this much faith, this much trust in the US dollar? But apparently Trump operates at one speed and one speed only, because here's how he responded to Brics nations essentially working together to move away from the US dollar. Take a look.
A couple days ago, you issued a new tariff threat to members of the Brics countries for if they aligned with anti-American policies.
10% charge.
That would be India, Brazil, Russia,
They have to pay 10% if they're in Brics. Because Brics was set up to hurt us. Brics was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in Brics is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir? Or is that
pretty soon.
If they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of Brics, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff just for that one thing. And they won't be a member long. I thought Brics was, I said this about a year ago, and it largely broke up. But, there are a couple that hang around, but I thought it largely broke up. Brics is not, in my opinion, not a serious threat. But what they're trying to do is destroy the dollar.
Well, they are trying to destroy the dollar. Whether or not they're going to be successful in doing so remains to be seen. But again, there is increased interest in the international community to move away from SWIFT, to invest in gold as opposed to the US dollar. And let's also remember, since Trump is thinking about retaliating against Brics nations through additional tariffs, international investors have also been concerned about rising debt levels. Trump's tax cutting big beautiful bill could add another $3.3 trillion to the US debt over the next 10 years. And as I mentioned earlier, the tariffs and the uncertainty pertaining to Trump's tariffs policy, his trade wars and all that, that has led to an increase of central banks around the world wanting to no longer invest in US currency and instead invest in gold. So he's essentially compounding the situation by moving forward with the same policies that have partly created this mess in the first place. So we'll see what happens, but it's important to understand what's happening in the international community, how America is perceived in the international community. You're not really going to get a good description of that if you're just consuming American media. But when you have all these countries trying to find ways to work around the United States, to no longer really invest in the United States, when there's this distrust in the international community, you got to ask why. And our leaders should be held accountable for that, right? If they're engaging in policies that could eventually lead to the dethroning of the US dollar, we as Americans would be in a lot of trouble. We got to keep it real on that.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.